Okay, so I've started our recording. Welcome to the City of Portsmouth Public Art Review Committee meeting for May the 10th, 2023. And I'll leave the Zoom link open for now in case Bob comes in, but I will shut it down if we don't need it. So, welcome and thank you for coming back on short notice. We have about an hour meeting today, but we can go a little longer, but I'd like to just jump into the agenda if that works for everybody. So the first thing is I guess I'll await a motion to accept the minutes from the March 29th meeting, unless there are any edits or corrections.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. And now we're moving on very quickly on to another vote. So we have an offer from Chris Dwyer and Bob Thorson to co-chair this committee. I would await a motion to approve.
I move to approve Chris Dwyer and Bob Thorson as co-chairs of the Public Art Review Committee.
Oh, Bob better show up then.
Second motion.
Great. All in favor?
Aye.
Did you get somebody to second that?
I did. Yes.
Beth?
Yeah,
Oh,
Beth.
yeah, okay. Just wanted to make sure that.
Great. I guess I'll open it up to the group. We don't have a nomination for a secretary or I'll say a note taker, minute taker. I didn't know if there was anybody interested in that at this point. If not, I will turn it over to the co-chairs to
Sign someone.
To assign someone.
to work on
Or
that.
have people think more about that. Because basically, I think we're talking about pretty high-level notes, right, Sean? We're not talking about, great detail.
Yes.
I don't know if that changes anybody's mind.
What I've learned in my role here is as someone who takes notes, it's really mostly about the motions. It's about attendance and the motions and the votes. It's not about word for word taking those said notes. And in cases where I've been in meetings where there's a lot of conversation, I'll say refer to the recording. That's why we record the meetings. So it is not a huge heavy lift, to Chris's point.
Mm-hmm.
So
So does that change
Food for
anybody's
thought.
mind? About willingness to do it? Not yet?
not yet.
Okay.
I think it's a
All
not
right.
yet.
All right, so Sean, you'll do some notes for tonight?
Yes,
then?
I will.
Okay.
Great.
So I think Nancy and I are going to talk a little bit about the criteria, and then I would hope we might have a little bit of time to think about our next steps, which I have some ideas about what that might be, but I think we should all kind of put out what we think some next steps would be. So Nancy, do you want to start with because the idea for this is to sort of familiarize ourselves with the criteria. I know in just preparing it to talk about the African Burying Ground, looking at the criteria, putting them side by side, raised a number of issues for me. So I think that's the purpose of doing it, both to familiarize ourselves, but also we may need to do some refinement of criteria.
Yeah, and my goal is to walk you through what one successful project was like from start to finish, and we followed. Before I begin, show of hands, how many, when we talk about the percent for art ordinance, everybody knows what that is, the percent for art? Okay, and everybody has at least glanced at or acknowledges that we have public art guidelines that the city, okay, great. So this is a project that is a percent for art ordinance project over at Foundry Place that went through the whole process of the guidelines. And I thought it would be good to walk you through what our committee did, how long it took, and just so that we have kind of eyes wide open as we go into this. Mm-hmm. So, Sean, could you pull up the?
I thought I could.
You just.
Did I have it?
I saw it.
Ew, why is that man's face in this room?
All right, hold on. I brought this over on purpose.
Put their,
There we
oh, we
go.
can't put our hand over the screen.
It's not letting me.
Hand over your eyes.
Yeah, right.
We have our new Office 365, so bear with me. I'm hoping this is going.
Well, I'll just launch into it. If he
Might have
pulls
to
it up, he pulls it up. So what we did as a committee, we pulled together a committee per the actual guidelines for the project, and that committee pretty much acted like this whole group, but for one project. And it had the different types of people on. We had a designer, we had somebody from the city, we had a community member, we had somebody that understood engineering, the whole 9 yards. And that committee, the first thing we did was settle on a timeline for how long we thought it would take to understand the building, the site, get all the information we needed. Luckily, I was on the garage committee at the time. Create the RFP with community input, run that by the city and all the legal requirements, do a call to artists that was going to be long enough to do a national call. So, we had to factor, oh, here we go. So these are all the things that our committee had to do. We had to pull together the committee, we set our timeline, and part of that timeline involved some community input. So we held the community education and input session in the Levinson room at the library. I actually have that presentation here, and I'll just walk you through it real quickly so that you understand how we got community input. We had to create the RFP, do the call for artists. We held an on-site information session with any artist who was interested. We even had a couple on FaceTime so that they could see it even though they weren't local. Then we, in this whole timeline, we made time for the review process. I have the rubric on here to show you. We had semifinalist interviews, then we had the selection, and then we made our official recommendation to council because, of course, the council has to accept anything that we recommend to make it an actual project. Okay, next slide.
Nope. There we go.
Okay, so this was the overview that we did at the library. We talked about public art and placemaking, and okay, you can go ahead. And we just gave an overview of the Percent for Art ordinance to the 25, 30 people that were in the room. Okay, you can go ahead. I'm just going to do this quickly.
Okay.
We talked about the projects that were part of the Percent for Art ordinance and how the parking garage at Foundry Place was really the first one that was going to have the process start from start to finish fully funded, the whole percent, the whole $150,000. Okay. And we gave definitions about public art and placemaking. Okay. And just keep going. We don't really have to. This is how we explained the timeline. As you can see, this was an 18-month process. We started in the early part of 2017 with exploring, as I said, the opportunities of the site. We factored in the public input while we were deciding that. And then we considered the RFP process, and the call to artists was a pretty big chunk of time. It took a long time to create the RFP with the legal department, and that was a lesson learned. I'll talk about that at the end if we have any time, because we left something out in terms of confidentiality, and then we got called by the paper, and it turned into this big drama. And that was a lesson learned. And then we had the selection of artists where we used the rubric and our guidelines to, we set time for that. And then, of course, the installation. And so this was all set up before. And we pretty much stuck to our timeline. Our selection of artists kind of bumped into February and March, but their installation was kind of shorter, and we had everything wrapped up by spring. So it worked out well.
In that RFP process, I know you said it needed a couple tweaks, but is that a pretty good framework that we'll be able to use?
Yes, and we still have it. Yep. Okay. So we talked about the archaeological study that was done on the site by the architects that the city purchased the land from. So this is the education piece. You can just kind of go through these, Sean, if you wouldn't mind. The history, what was there, the foundries, the factories, that sort of thing. We painted a much nicer picture than I'm doing right now. But just so you know, we walked through history with everybody. Go ahead. Showed them some renderings of what the area looked like. Okay. Yep. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yep, I know, this is the whole thing. So this is the part where afterward, we put the big Post-it notes all over the room with markers and highlighters, and we asked the public, how can we use the information they had just learned of the past of that area and make a bridge to the future? We're building something entirely new, and how can public art be that bridge? And what are some words, some feelings, some themes that resonated with the people in the room? And we explained how we would incorporate their ideas into the RFP, which is we took all the, it was me, I did it. I took all the big Post-it notes back to the ArtSpeak office. I consolidated everything, I categorized everything that they said. They turned into themes, and those themes made their way into the RFP. So that's how we did that. And then the next phase was creating the RFP, doing the national call for artists, and we posted it all over the country, online in platforms all over the country. And about a third of the way into that process, we went to the site with some of the engineers and some of the city people, and we took the artists all through the site to show them all the places where they could apply and put their art, where they could, where they couldn't. And it was a pretty open, architecture was also part of it. They could put things on the building if they wanted to. And so that was a really helpful thing. Okay, can move forward. Then this is just a screenshot of the RFP, although it was many, many pages, but I just wanted to show you, okay? Then, go forward, thank you. Then when it came time, we got 11 submissions. And this is when the rubric came in really handy, and you can't see it, but I separated all of the things that we were evaluating out at the bottom there. And you'll notice what we weren't doing is saying, I like this, I don't like this. That's not what we were evaluating the pieces. We were evaluating on very specific things, so we were all looking at it individually. I mean, we had our own rubrics, but as a group, we would come together and discuss these: the artistic merit, the experience of the artist or the team that submitted the pieces. What would the maintenance be like? How about the technical feasibility? What was their budget? And I'll talk about why that was really important. The visibility of the piece on the site, the accessibility of it, all of these things. So that's what we were evaluating. And then, Sean, if you can, so this was my personal rating sheet, and I'm just going to point out two names for you: Terrence Parker, that I put for number 1, and Seth Palmater, that I put for number 6. Now, Seth Palmater was number 6 out of 11 in my personal rubric, but when we came together as a team and we put all of our numbers against each other's, there was jockeying for position just based on who's number 1, who's number 2, and who's number 3. And so Seth's name rose just he was my number 6, but he was number 1 and 2 for a lot of other people. He's ultimately one of the 2 artists that got picked, and I will explain further why. And that is because when we did the artist interviews, then the conversations about technical feasibility and maintenance and experience and just all of that really kind of sifted through, and budget, really sifted through the projects that were going to be able to rise to the top easily, quickly, without a lot of additional thinking and additional funding. And so the other thing is that both Seth and Terrence were able to scale back their submissions. So we got 2 pieces for our budget instead of 1, and we felt that that was a really good bang for our buck. So even though, I just wanted to point this out, even though I personally didn't put Seth Palmer, and he's the one that did the etched, the founder?
glass.
Yeah.
What is that called? A founder? The blacksmith,
Blacksmith.
sorry. The blacksmith on the glass tower of the stairwell, it's on 2 sides. His original was much bigger and grander, and he scaled it back, and Terrence had a couple of sets of the hammers, and he scaled that back, and that's how we ended up with those 2 pieces, not because they were any of our particular favorites, but because for all the criteria, they hit them all the most. So I just wanted to make that really clear, because having these kind of guidelines and this rubric takes so much emotion, and just, it makes difficult conversations easier. That's all I wanted to say about that. Okay. And then what we did was we made our recommendation to the council. I believe that's actually the last slide, where we officially this was part of Art Speak, we officially submitted this to Kelly Clark, and she put it in the council packet. And we invited both of the artists to come and do a mini presentation to the council for them to accept the works. So that was the process from start to finish. Like I said, it was 18 months. We did not think ahead. In our minds, we wanted the semifinalist process to be anonymous, because we wanted to share them with the community, but we didn't want to put names attached to them for many reasons. And the paper threatened us with a Freedom of Information Act if we didn't provide the names for them. And I got on the phone with everybody, including the publisher, including the editor, and they were just really not cooperative. So the lesson learned there was, if we want to do an anonymous part of any of that, we have to put it in the RFP. That was our lesson learned there. And then
How many semifinalists were there, Karen?
6.
6, okay.
There were 6.
So half of
6 out of.
Yeah.
the submissions made it to the.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm sorry,
And
I
so-
can't hear you. Can you?
So half of the overall submissions made it to semifinalists.
Yes,
Yeah.
but some of the submissions were, like, some people submitted more than one piece.
Oh, okay.
So we had a couple of different
Yeah.
individual artists with a few different projects.
Multiple, okay.
So we just kind of brought a lot of people in because we wanted, and most of that was for technical. We wanted to talk through the technical aspects and the maintenance and all that.
And are the rubrics that everybody does that get merged to be one giant spreadsheet formula?
Sort of. How we did it is really, we just took each of our top 3 picks, and when we kind of put them all out, some rose to the top, and we just selected those to bring in to speak with. I mean, it was very numerical.
Yeah, I like the numerical.
You got a big
And just
question.
a question, so you said Seth and Terrence adjusted theirs. Did all of the submitters have a chance to adjust, or how did that work?
I believe we did that because their budgets came in so much lower.
Oh,
Their
okay.
budgets were well below, and because they had pieces that were, I don't know that we asked that of everybody, because some people, they went right out to the end of the budget, and
Yep.
that
Yep.
was,
They just spent all 100.
Right, right,
So you couldn't do it.
right, right.
Well, I mean, it looks
But I
phenomenal.
don't remember, to be honest, if we asked other people. We probably did, but I don't remember. But I just wanted to say the 2 takeaways were the guidelines that we followed made this a really, I don't want to say easy, because that's my next takeaway. I did all the work for this. I was the chair of the committee. I was the city council liaison, and we did not have a staff person. We had a staff person on our committee, but they were not in the capacity. They were actually a voting member of the committee.
Could you tell who other committee members were?
Yeah, it was myself, it was Karina Quintens, who is a local photographer and writer.
And lives in the neighborhood.
And lives in the neighborhood. It was Becky Holt, who is a visual artist and had done some volunteer work with Art Speak. It was Kathy Sununu, who was very involved in writing the guidelines and on Art Speak. Dave Allen, who was the project manager for the parking garage. Nick Cracknell was our staff person. He was our reality check. But he had really, really good insight. And then we had Anya Rogers, who was the literal abutter and the person that we bought the property from, which is how we got access to that archaeological study. Because she was on there. And at one point, they thought they might incorporate some of the public art into their buildings one day. So, and I think that was it on the committee. I think that was it. But my recommendation moving forward would be whenever we have this kind of project with money attached to it, that we actually consider taking some of those funds and hiring a project manager so that the chairs of our committee aren't doing all this work. Because I was the chair of the committee. I did all the organization, wrote all the press. It was a very big job, and I already had a full-time job, and I was a city councilor, and I almost died. I'm done.
Other things you think we should take forward from this, or other questions people have that you're thinking about that we should take forward? I mean, this is a percent for art, so it's a little different than some of the other things that have happened.
So in the RFP process, you mentioned about all the sort of legal stuff, procurement and all that stuff. Do we think we have have we sort of fleshed out sort of a boilerplate of the, I'll call it general conditions or things like that?
I'm
that would
very
be-
happy to send our RFP to Chris and Bob, and they can, kind
Yeah.
of look at it and see if it might be something that they would want to share with the group.
If we have consistent use of, if we have a consistently
Yeah.
acceptable process particularly with the procurement stuff.
Well, a lot of the procurement stuff the boilerplate is basic procurement, whether you were,
Yeah, we could be
hiring.
We could be buying, I don't know.
Exactly.
Toilet seats.
Right,
whatever,
exactly.
yeah.
So a lot of that is basic, but I do think, Nancy, I highlighted some things here that are important, so it'd be good to look at it, like the expectations for the artists in terms of advertising, in terms of anonymity. We did something similar with the Burying Ground. We didn't run into the same issues. I think maybe because we did discuss them in public, but had numbered them and didn't announce names. But tightening up some things like that would be useful as we look at the RFP.
Yeah, no, we redacted the names when we were discussing them, but that's why the paper
Yeah.
wanted them. Lesson learned.
Did the artists care one way or the other whether they were going to be named? Did
Sure.
They wanted to be?
Well, you don't necessarily want to be known as somebody who didn't get the.
Right, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah,
Because I just wondered if they cared one way or the other. To say that,
Alyssa, you
Yeah,
were.
I can speak to it because in full disclosure, I was on one of the teams my firm partnered with other people. We were one of the teams that was considered there. So yes, we cared a lot, and no, typically the artist does not want their name put forward if they're not going to be awarded. And just as we think about the RFP, thinking about how it lands on the other side and what sort of onerous hoops we may be putting people through.
That's right.
Is something to really consider.
Yes. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because she's going to talk about a completely different way to manage this, which I think if I were ever to do it over again, I would do it that way.
Yeah, yeah. The hoops are really important in these things, and also the protection of the artists' rights in terms of what they've put forth.
Intellectual property.
Intellectual property. So there are a lot of things to protect there. Yeah. Good.
I'm trying to remember when we did the public art pieces for Hampton Beach. It was through the State Arts Council. And that wasn't, there was no anonymity. It was completely, everybody's name was on it. And Yeah, but there was no negotiation of like, can you bring the price down kind of thing. That's the one that makes me nervous.
Yeah.
Is that becomes, that you did what you did. That makes me very
Yeah.
nervous as, you know, having entered many design competitions. And, you know, some people run practices on doing that. They have, you know,
Yes.
they are very successful and they make a lot of money on the commissions that they get, but not everybody. And most people lose a lot and never get it back. So, you know, you can say that's part of my portfolio. It was something, it was an idea that I wanted to explore. I'm a better person for it. Whatever. I lost a lot of sleep. I'll never get that sleep back
Yeah.
for that. So, it's just interesting to compare and contrast. So this is only applicable to the 1% art program, with specifically with public buildings that
And
the
public
city.
funding.
And public funding, okay. That is actually building things, or, yeah, okay.
But there are now evolving, and the African Burying Ground is an example of this, non-percent for art things that are also public funds, right? And public projects. So
Right.
think right now about the 400th, and that's something I want to bring up at the end, the sculpture park there. That's privately raised, but it's a public project. So we've got that nuance, too, that we got to
Right.
think
Well,
about.
we all had that little adventure at the beginning of our existence.
Right, right. So we've got a number
Yeah,
of
it's like, yeah, okay.
possibilities there to think about. So I can talk about the African Burying Ground, and we can see some contrast there. And I want to just put up a few images first, if that
Hopefully.
works.
Hopefully.
Just to kind of remind you of the different pieces that are there in the burying ground. Should be an attachment. And I saw you had it, actually. It's called ABG, and you had clicked on it.
Did I?
It's behind this. I can see the edge of it. There you
Yes.
go.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay. So, yeah, just click
Oh,
through.
Sorry. Here we go.
So, the African Burying Ground, 2003, before we had a public art ordinance, before we had all this, there was a very extensive public input process that didn't yield public art, but yielded a landscape design. That was the first part of this. And the landscape design, which, you know, think of it there without the public art pieces, was done by Robbie Woodburn, was good, but insufficient from the perspective of the descendant community, the African Americans who are currently in the community. And so that's what prompted the city to go out for a public art process to add to the landscape design. This was all private money. We raised $1.25 million to do it. And the idea from the beginning was it was private money, because this was before all the public art pieces. And so an interesting thing about this is it's got a number of pieces to it, and you could consider it all a work of public art. You could consider some of the poetry written for it that's there, an aspect of the public art, as well as what we often think of, the statues themselves. So go on to the next piece, just so we look at some of the pieces that are there.
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
How was that list developed? I mean,
Was-
the concept of, you know, I stand for,
Okay, that was one of the contestants, Jerome Meadows, who won the commission, wrote that as part of his commission, and then used that as part of his design. So nobody else, none of the other offers did anything quite like that, but that was part of his design. So, you know, the pieces that people might think of as the public art pieces, the Mother Africa and the first enslaved man brought to Portsmouth, the entry sculpture, and then go on to the next piece. And then the pieces that are where the burial vault is, you can think of that as a public art piece, as well as those are to stand for the people of Portsmouth. And then the paddles from the slave ships with the kente cloth tiles in them, another aspect of public art. And then one more piece. And then, you might also think of these as public art, the features that were added that provide context, the petition line from the 1778 petition, the little platform that gives kind of the story of it and has carvings on it, and then the lines of the poems that are on the statues themselves. So there are a number of pieces in this.
So in this case, there were a number of different artists who did those different pieces, and they were installed into the,
All the same artist.
oh, really?
A
All
really,
of those different pieces?
a really great point, because that's not going to be true in a lot of cases. And so the unity of it comes from a similar design. Now, I will also say that we had artisans who,
Craftspeople.
craftspeople
yeah.
who actually executed pieces of
Right,
it,
right.
so.
Okay, so the artist was the generator of the ideas.
That's right,
And
designer,
then fabricated by different
that's right.
craftspeople. Okay.
Yes, he fabricated the statues.
I see.
So I took, knowing, and Nancy talking about process, what I did was to take our sets of guidelines that we could kind of look at the African Bear Gun in light of the guidelines, as well as a second set that I'll give you. So what I took from our existing documents, on the left-hand side is the criteria that are embodied in setting up this committee. And on the right-hand side are the procedural guidelines that you can recognize from what Nancy has presented. And I put them side by side because, to begin with, they're similar, but they're not the same. So the procedural guidelines go into some more detail, and they add some things that are not in our standing committee guidelines. I think they're all good, but you can see the quality of art, appropriateness for the size, the context, which is a really important piece of public art, maintenance and installation, aesthetics, which I want to talk about separately, the maintenance plan, the durability. Diversity is something that's in the procedural guidelines, and of course it was really important for this particular, for the African Burying Ground. We also did a national competition, and most of the artists that entered were African American, I think. Not all of our finalists were, and that's probably an important thing to, especially now, to be thinking about when we think about the meaning of a particular work and who the artist is. And then the other thing that's in the procedural guidelines are the experience of the artist in doing completed artworks and successful completion of projects, which is a thing in public art because there's so many more things proposed than ever get completed or funded, as well as the artist's track record of, installation in an outdoor arena that's going to last for a long time, is going to take care of vandalism and all these things. So the artist's experience is really important, and that's in the guidelines, not included in our criteria for this committee. So I think one thing we're going to want to do at some point is think about how we start to reconcile these different pieces, what broad criteria we want to use. And I want to go back to aesthetics because that's always a hard one. And I worked with Americans for the Arts on developing aesthetic criteria for community art projects, because aesthetics is one of those, how do you define it? Do you know it when you see it? It's beauty, but more in the Greek sense, not beautiful as we know it. It's meaningfulness. And we worked with a group of national artists from many different ethnicities to try to develop a set of criteria for aesthetics that cut across visual arts, theater, literature, dance. And when I took this back out and looked at it and realized, and I put in bold those that I think are really very relevant to the African Burying Ground Project, so that as we go into, since aesthetics is in our guidelines, it might be something we want to pay more attention to. And this is now being used by a number of the private philanthropies, the foundations that fund art. And most of these have held up pretty well. And you might argue, even for the ones that aren't in bold, that the African Burying Ground represents, speaks to some of these criteria.
So when you sent out your RFP, you didn't actually call for the artists to have such a coherent sense of what they were doing?
We did not, and I would definitely say that our two other finalists did not have a coherent sense, and so the coherence ended up being a big part of it. One artist wanted to do something he had done in other places, which was like a large globe that, it was interesting, and another artist had the idea for a statue, but I think what was winning to people. Now, not all of the pieces that I showed you there were conceived at the beginning, but the opening, the Mother Africa was, the people of Portsmouth, the burial vault, and the fence. Those were all part of the original conceptualization. There were other aspects of the conceptualization that, because this is where people are buried, the State Historic Resources had a say in it. Our original plan was to plant linden trees that would have looked close to an African tree, and we were not allowed to plant anything. So because the Historic Resources said, that it would disturb the remains. Of course, every cemetery you've ever gone into, the beauty of it are the trees, right? But, so there were aspects of the design that couldn't be for that reason because of human remains actually fulfilled. And similarly, we couldn't, once we did the first borings and realized at the top of the hill, the graves are only 12 to 18 inches below the surface. We couldn't do some of the larger, the original pieces were intended to be larger. I'm glad they're not, but they were intended to have more of a scale, and those people of Portsmouth were intended to kind of be spaced down, but couldn't support them because it couldn't go down far enough to support them.
So you worked with the artists to
Oh,
revise?
Completely, but that was after the artist was selected. But I wanted you to see how, you can really see how the criteria get realized. Even though we didn't have these criteria, the criteria are really realized in the installation and in the design. And I think we will need to do something about aesthetics, because the reason we have that little platform there is just a real debate among people on the committee who felt the need for something more real, more realism, more realistic, something people could read and hold on to. We're not comfortable with the sort of abstract, if you want to, it doesn't feel abstract to me, but there was a sense that it was a little too abstract. And so that, it was an addition, a compromise addition.
That the figures were abstract?
Yeah. Yeah. Different tastes, right? That's why.
Well, it's really nice to see the comparison, because what we're seeing is the difference between, basically sort of a a strategic or I don't want to call it formulaic, it's not what I mean.
Structured.
That the garage was formulaic, but it had a very ordered process.
Right.
As opposed to an iterative process where you basically engage a relationship.
Right.
With a foundation of some ideas that feel like, seem really good.
Right.
But then you let it unfold in whatever criteria come up, like structure or things, that those unfold naturally in the formation of the final piece.
I mean, the other
And
thing.
I understand that
The
two
totally different.
Right, I mean, I don't think
Totally
that when
different.
you're dealing with engineers for a parking garage, you're going to get that kind of.
That's right.
Right.
And
I
remember,
don't know.
It seemed like there was
I'm the
wiggle
No,
pretty-
I was on the
pretty
committee.
I'm the pretty committee for a lot of engineers, so
I'm telling you.
they can be brought around.
We
but-
created our timeline for that
Yeah.
project
Right.
because we wanted it to happen.
But it is very interesting to.
That's it.
Your discussion about, and I, just disclosure, I was the facilitator for for the Memorial for the Old Man
Yeah,
process. And we had 3 finalists, and they didn't know, the committee didn't know how to select them, so I got a chance to work with each of them. So one came in, and he basically had an idea that was his idea, basically imposed upon the context, which was, and he was a super nice guy, but he was clearly working out some issues and bringing it to the shore of that lake. And then the next folks had basically something that they did. They did 18-foot tall bronze trees. And if you can imagine what it would have been like to plant 18-foot tall bronze trees in Franconia Notch with, with 100-mile-an-hour winds sometimes, with stained glass leaves.
oh my God.
It was just so that one, and then the final people that came in had something that was truly of the place and of the history, of the story, and the character was just like, oh my God, this is, it's perfectly right. But unfortunately, it was, 5 times more expensive than the first one.
Right.
So it didn't get fully realized. But it was a different, at least there was the opportunity for someone to have their own artistic vision, bring it to the table,
Develop it.
and then have some kind of a coherent understanding of it, of what each of those intentions were. So I really like all of this. It's really nice.
Timeline and money, because we did this and we had no money. We had to raise whatever it was going to cost. So that's a huge difference.
That's a big
And
difference.
timeline is a huge difference. It took us 10 years to do the burying ground. So that's a huge, you got these huge differences here. And I've got to believe that coming to this committee are going to be that full range of projects like that. So we might want to consider how we think differently about criteria for different kinds of projects. We might start with a base, but we might begin to flesh this out a little bit in a different way. And the coherence is something that is much on my mind as we think about the Gateway Park.
But that is being selected bit by bit, as opposed to a person who kind of says.
Well, we need to
"We'll do
talk
this,
about
we'll do
that. I
that,
think
we'll
we
do
should
something."
talk about that.
Yeah, I think so.
So I wonder if there are any other thoughts about criteria, or we bring this to,
The one question I had, when you were talking about that, and again, I think it depends a lot on the actual project itself, but one of the criteria seems, especially with the African burial ground, like you talked about it, would be openness to adaptation. Because you had to adapt that, because it was going to be very tall and now it wasn't going to work. So
Right.
is the artist, is the design adaptable to that? It wouldn't have worked it wouldn't be, I don't think, as much of an issue in the parking garage, because that's pretty much of a structured thing. But there may be some other things, and it may be something that if we talk about with the Gateway Park, who knows what's underneath there? If there's something that ever came up to something like that.
right. And that may be something that goes in an RFP, that flexibility, that adaptability, so that there isn't the sense of, oh, you changed it, you violated the terms of the
Well,
contract.
and then we talk about the relationship, and I think that's the whole point, because you have to work with the artist to be able to have that relationship, to make sure those changes are adaptable to the actual site.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that just hanging out on the fourth floor with legal, there's clauses that can address. The city ultimately has that final say, and if it's something that is a reasonable impediment or change or adaptation, I'm confident that we could put the language in there.
Yeah. I mean, some of that to me also goes to the experience of the artist, which is in those criteria, and the work that the artist has done before. So you can judge that as a criteria, the adaptability of the artist's ability to, make changes and to work with a committee. And the experience of an artist in working with a committee, not that this is not my way or the highway kind of relationship, so.
I have a
Well,
question.
you don't negotiate with an Andy Warhol, though. There are some artists that will not negotiate.
And
You
he
don't
probably didn't do
negotiate
any
with
public
Christo.
art commissions, right?
not
Christo
sure,
did, but Christo did.
He used to, I think he had I think he had a golden tongue. And he had a French accent, so, that goes a long way. But I think it's again, having been in a number of these, the question of like what gets negotiated versus what gets you in the door
Yeah.
to be the candidate.
Yeah,
And there's always, we're seeing it down on the 400 thing is, there's the ability, the integrity of, like, if you're horse trading something, that's a difficult thing to ask someone who's coming in with artistic integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also something, my concern of some of this is that if someone's not qualified to do it, they probably shouldn't be there, and we probably should have maybe an initial step of like an
Q.
RFQ. To basically say, you're going to be an acceptable individual or entity to
Yeah.
enter into this thing. And
That's probably a good idea.
maybe that's something to consider,
Yeah.
as a part of a process. I remember one competition that we entered it was a very, it was an ideas competition, and it was, the entry was a single 8.5 by 11 piece of paper.
yeah,
And that began, that spiraled into what was then a national competition.
but again, being careful that you're not asking too much of the artist before you,
Yeah, yeah.
do something. Beth,
And
you?
when you did the garage project, did you already know what sort of elements you wanted? Like, we're definitely going to do some etchings on the
No,
glass. and we
not
did-
at
it was
all.
just-
The RFP included themes from our public input
yep.
that talked about industrial
Okay.
and the nature that was there, the estuary, because it was on the North Mill Pond, and all those things. We tried to be evocative of things, that descriptive things. And then we did that site walk with some artists in person and some virtual to show them the building, the inside, the outside, all the areas, and the grounds surrounding. And that's
Okay.
what we did.
Nancy, what was the budget? Did you mention?
150, but not quite all of it. We kept 10% back for maintenance and perpetuity, and I would recommend that we would also keep some back if we were going to ever take on a project to hire some administrative help to do some of the work that I did, because it was an 18-month-long project. There was lots of coordinating with the artists, with the city, with the group. It was with the community, education. It was just a lot of work.
So, anything else on this, or do we want to spend our last 15 minutes kind of with what are the topics we need to take up next? So, I'll put out a few, and then no particular order. From this conversation, I think we need to look at criteria, maybe for different types of situations that we're going to be put in. I would like us sooner rather than later to understand and maybe come forth with our relationship to the land use boards, because part of the, I know from Kate's, talking with Kate, part of the original impetus for this is that right now the Historic District Commission has been reviewing and saying yay or nay to public art. I think HDC and Board of Adjustment are the two that public art has come to. Planning Board really wouldn't have a connection to it unless it was some huge piece in a wetland, let's say. But land use boards, how our judgments relate to the land use boards, how they refer to us, I think we've got to clarify that. We can posit some things and then work with legal and counsel to get that approved. And then a third, more specific thing is how we relate to the ongoing projects like the Gateway Park, and how this group can help with the coherence of sites like that. You know, right now, there's the one sculpture underway, but nobody else seems to have jurisdiction for what happens after that. So those are three things that I had on a list that we need to tackle, I think. And let's build out the list and then decide what we should do.
I think we should find out what other percent for art might be on deck or in waiting
Yep.
for us.
Good. And some that have not been exercised and expended.
Exactly.
The money for the school is still there. So we should have that as an active list, something we would look at on a regular basis.
Sort of catch up on stuff that hasn't been exercised.
And I
I'm
think Kate
sorry,
mentioned the
I
fire
can't hear
department.
you.
I'm sorry,
Oh.
I just said
Last time?
catch up
On
on
old
things
things.
that are
Yeah.
still outstanding.
Yeah.
And I wonder if eventually we want to create an invitation, a thought piece that developers, that can be given to developers, that says, we'd love to have art on your site. Here are some things you should think about when you site your building,
Yep.
when you are, designing the building. And it needs to come in early in the process. It's so much better when it comes in early in the process rather than later in the process, if you're planning to make the art piece a focal point of whatever you're doing, whether that's built into the structure or whether it's a separate piece. But I know from having sat on the Historic District Commission that sometimes it's really hard when people come with various things after the fact and haven't really thought through the whole. So that may be a way that we can, or think about guidelines or whatever else.
Ellen, can I just clarify, when you talk about connect with developers, you're talking private developers?
Private, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because of course, the public art has spurred an interest in developers adding to their buildings, so I think that's a good idea.
Is that,
Send for Art is only for public
It's
projects.
public,
So
yeah.
that there isn't like, builders in New York City get like a certain little perk if they take a swath of ground in front of their buildings and make it public.
Well, that is part of actually our CUPs, our conditional use permits. Public art isn't necessarily a piece of that, but it can be offered as an example, so we have that.
where does that, I heard there was a fountain, an RBG fountain going in. Like, how does that fit in?
That's private
Private.
developer
Okay.
Inside a structure.
I'm sorry, which fountain are we talking about?
The Ruth Bader Ginsburg that
The brick
is going
market?
into the brick market.
Ah,
But that didn't run by any,
No, it's just like you doing something in your house.
okay.
You know.
However, they did do a call to artists. They did it more like the African Burying Ground did, where
Right.
they brought in people to talk about their concepts, not necessarily a scale model or a drawing or anything fully fleshed out, so so that was more,
But wasn't that subject to the Historic District Commission?
It's inside. So remember, Historic District has
Really?
outside.
There's
the
an
RGB is
outside
outside.
fountain.
That's in the courtyard.
Oh, you're right.
Courtyard.
It's out
in the
my window.
courtyard.
Yeah, that's the court.
So I would have thought it
You're
would
right.
need to go through the HDC,
Interesting.
unless.
well, so a few things happened since we were on the council and since Art Speak dissolved, and one of those things is, and I think it happened in our last term, in like the fall, like that 2019 fall, is the Supreme Court had a ruling on hate speech that necessitated us updating our ordinances
Oh, you're
on
right.
signage.
Right.
And when we did that, we did this big multi-page update on the zoning and the policies on signage, and that had an unintended consequence then of making it so that murals fell under signage
Or they can anyway, depending on,
if they have anything including an explanation of the mural.
yeah,
And so,
words.
yes, words, because words can be, the argument is words can be an advertisement or, whatever. So that's one of the reasons why these unobtrusive little projects now are going up before the, what is not the HDC, but the other one,
Zoning Board of
the
Adjustment.
Zoning Board of Adjustment, to see if they need a variance to be able to put up a sign. So we had to go through all these hoops when we put up the Ruth Blay mural on Court Street. And that's when I realized that vote, we need to, and I went to the city, but then it's been 2 planning directors later, but I think this committee has a really strong case to go to make a recommendation to decouple
Right.
public art that is two-dimensional, from the signage ordinance. I think that's
Right.
that should be one of the first things we
Yeah.
do, because they don't want to be looking at murals.
And some things have been turned down that I think would have been good additions to the city because the HTC didn't really,
They're
they-
not following guidelines.
They're not using
Yeah.
guidelines, right, that are related to aesthetics
Yeah.
and whatever, so.
Yeah.
Other things that should be on our list. Kate, do you have a,
Do you mind if I come up?
No.
For a second? I was just gonna sit here while you.
Here, I have our things if you want to look at them.
So one of the things that I thought this committee, Kate Cook for the audience, one of the things that I thought this committee should definitely look at, I put in, when writing the Public Art Review Committee ordinance, put it into the responsibilities of the committee, and that is to take kind of a comprehensive look at where in the city we have public spaces that can be dedicated for public art pieces. And so that's any public property. And this committee is unique in that it has that role. And it has that role leading up to the master planning process, which we assume will start by January of next year. So this committee could make recommendations to the council to be included in the master planning process around
Great.
public art space.
great.
Now, that will be fun.
So Nancy has kind of proposed maybe that we start with, because of, as a priority, that we start with this, I'll say the relationship to the land use boards, is signage is a part of it, but does that work for people?
Has the legal department looked at that as an issue just relative to zoning Has the legal department looked at that relative to like zoning language or anything?
Well, I think one of the things we would want to do is have the legal
Have them
department
do
come
that.
and talk with us about
Okay,
that.
all right.
I think, I look at, when we started making the list, I thought, oh, I know what's most important to me, but by the time I got to the bottom of the list, I thought, holy moly. So it strikes me that maybe it would be really good, since we're like 1 minute away from 6:30, for us to
think about it?
Well, and prioritize, like according, I mean, I'm thinking of the little chart that, where you
Yeah.
put your number, like if everybody could say, 1, 2, and 3, or 1, 2,
Yeah.
however many there are. Or I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I might have left out 1 or 2, but, if, like, you could sort of have a list of things, and everybody could sort of, order them, that maybe we could decide what would be a really good ones to start with, or, maybe have
I think-
subgroups working on them or
I
something.
think that's a good idea. I think what we should do, and I can start this, I can work with Sean, we should, do a little description of each one of these, so that we're certain we know what we're talking about, and maybe even estimate effort, because, the land use thing is going to be big. Public spaces that could be dedicated could be scalable. It could be something that could be done maybe more quickly than some other things. So maybe a little estimate of
How long
effort
would-
along with that, and then we could prioritize at the opening of our next meeting.
Yeah, okay, that would be good.
That's a great idea.
Yep.
And possibly even have legal come and talk to us a little bit about what we need to think about related to land use, because that's going to take a long time.
So will you, or, I know there's no secretary, but, so will you write up, or someone write up?
Yeah.
A list of what we
Yeah,
suggested?
what we think they are.
What they think they are.
Yeah. And I think we have a meeting, we all still agree to do the one that's at the end of May, yes? Yeah, so that'll be timely. We can do that
So is the next meeting the 31st?
the 31st, and we can do that at the 31st meeting?
So,
Was it on-
Chris, I will not
Wonder
be
for a
here.
different day.
Okay.
Oh, we'll have to have our note taker.
Wasn't it?
Oh, on my calendar for the
You'll
24th.
notice it for
I don't
us
see it at all.
and
I
get
will
it.
take care of all that.
Okay, great.
I have it on the calendar for the 24th.
Can we turn the camera off while we
Anyone
tie someone to
else?
the table and
I don't,
make
Sure.
make
Mo-
sure
mo-
somebody does what happens to
31st
get
at
something?
5:15.
I would entertain a
is what-
motion to
Okay,
adjourn.
let's show an invitation on the 24th. And I,
Ca-
just.
Maybe it's
that's
for
just-
something else. Maybe you shouldn't just get
no,
rid
I
of
have
it.
it on the 31st.
You do?
Whatever a
Okay.
Wednesday is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Wednesday, the 31st. And then we had one other, June 28th.
28th.
Yeah.
So we had those two.
So,
I won't be able to be here.
Say that again, we
So
had
we're on the
one other.
31st.
We have?
June 28th.
June 28th.
Glad we had
June 28th.
But, it's possible, Mara, as you suggested, that by that time, we might be able to do some small group work on some things to get us moving.
That sounds good.
I'd like to make one suggestion. If we're going to go down a legal rabbit hole, we should also have something that's fun.
I agree.
Otherwise, we will flee for the door.
I
If it's
agree.
just dealing with this zoning thing.
Great
It's
suggestion.
I think we need to do something that's fun, that's outside, and we can go walk around and just sort of blue sky what wonderful things we could do to
Well, when we're
offer
thinking
the
about
city.
public spaces, we can go look at them together. Or
That's right.
Absolutely.
have a
Yeah.
picnic at one of them.
Yes. And then we can adjourn the meeting, although there's question about like
Yeah.
walking around, what's our public meeting,
Yeah, no.
open meeting stuff, how
Well,
we can do that.
it is a public meeting. You have to notice it, and anybody who wants to walk with us
Right.
can come along.
It's like the Historic District Commission, they go and look
Site
at
visit.
properties, and then they have their meeting,
Right, right,
Yeah.
right.
so.
The middle school is close.
So can I just confirm, because I really want to get this right? We're going to meet on Wednesdays from 5:15 to 6:30. Is that what? Oh,
Yes, if,
That's good.
Okay.
when that's possible.
yes.
I think we all understood this time it wasn't going to be, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Great.
We're on the 31st of May, and then we're on the 28th of June.
June.
Okay.
So a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
I guess everybody's in favor.
So I will stop the recording.